£4,000 a week, after tax. That was the only number dancing in my head as I put my pen to sign that thick parchment contract. For someone shouldering a massive student debt and living on instant noodles in a shabby apartment in East London like me, that number was not just a salary, it was salvation. The job sounded suspiciously simple. Butler for Blackwood Castle, a massive grey stone fortress standing lonely on a sheer cliff in the Scottish Highlands, more than 30 miles of forest road from the nearest town of Inverness. No phone signal, spotty Wi-Fi, and just me and the master, Mr. Alistair, a man in his 70s, gaunt and always wearing outdated black velvet suits. "Do you sleep soundly, Thomas?" Mr. Alistair asked me during the interview. His voice sounded like dry leaves being crushed under a heel. "I sleep like the dead, sir," I lied. In reality, I suffered from chronic insomnia. He nodded, sliding his gold-rimmed glasses down his nose. "Good, because here we have very specific rules. You can go anywhere, use anything in this castle during the day, but..." He flipped to page 4 of the contract, pointing to a paragraph printed in bright red ink, standing out starkly against the black ink of the other lines. Clause 7. Staff must return to their private room in the West Wing before 11:58 p.m. The door must be locked from the inside. Absolutely do not leave the room, open the door, or look out into the hallway from 11:58 p.m. to 6 a.m. the next morning, no matter what you hear or see. No matter what? I laughed, trying to be funny to dispel the chill that had just run down my spine. "Are you afraid I'll meet a thief?" Mr. Alistair did not laugh. His cloudy gray eyes bore into me, unblinking. "No thief would dare come near Blackwood, son. Just remember, when the clock strikes 11:58, stay in your room. If you violate this, the contract is terminated immediately. And I fear losing your job will be the least of your worries." I signed. Of course I signed. I told myself it was just the eccentric habit of the old aristocracy. The first week of work passed strangely smoothly. The job only revolved around cleaning the 15th century iron armor suits, polishing the long oak floors, and ensuring the fireplace was always roaring. Blackwood Castle was beautifully gloomy. It smelled of beeswax, rotting wood, and a faint metallic smell I couldn't name, like old copper or dried blood. Tonight is my 7th night here. The grandfather clock in the main hall just struck heavy chimes, signaling 11:30 p.m. Outside, the wind screamed through the window cracks, creating long, mournful howls. I was about to turn off the light to sleep when I realized I had left my phone in the library downstairs. A feeling of laziness took over, but the thought of spending a night without music, to drown out this deadly silence, was even more terrifying. I looked at my wristwatch. 11:42 p.m. Still 16 minutes left, I mumbled, slipping my feet into my slippers. Plenty of time. That was the first mistake, and perhaps the biggest mistake of my life. The corridor leading down to the library was pitch black, with only silvery moonlight casting through the soaring arched windows, printing long, distorted shadows onto the floor. I turned on my phone flashlight, walking quickly down the oak staircase. Every step I took created an echoing creak, sounding like the joints of an ancient monster shifting. I found the phone lying on the leather reading table in the library. Everything was still normal. I sighed in relief, picked it up, and turned around. That was when I felt it. The air in the room suddenly changed. It became heavy, thick as if I were wading through water rather than walking in air. The temperature plummeted. My breath turned into a cloud of opaque white smoke in front of me. I looked at the phone screen. 11:52 p.m. Only 10 minutes had passed? Why did I feel like I had been down here for an hour? A chill ran down my spine. Not from physical cold, but from survival instinct, screaming. Run. I bolted out of the library, heading towards the stairs. But something was wrong. The corridor leading to the West Wing, where I had just passed less than 5 minutes ago, now looked unreasonably long and endless. The closed doors on both sides seemed to be shrinking, stretching the distance far away. I started running. My footsteps pounded on the floor, but the sound was strangely wet, not like sneakers on wood, but like bare feet running on mud. 11:56 p.m. My heart beat so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I rushed to my door, trembling hands inserting the key into the lock. The lock was jammed. "Damn it, open up!" I hissed, cold sweat pouring down my forehead. From the end of the corridor, where the darkness was thickest, I heard a sound. Clank. Metal hitting stone. Then a dragging sound. Screech. Screech. Like someone dragging a heavy, very heavy object across the floor. And it was getting closer. Click. The lock opened. I threw myself into the room, slammed the door, and slid the safety bolt immediately. I slid down the door, gasping, my chest aching as if it wanted to explode. The phone in my hand blinked, changing numbers. 11:58 p.m. 11:59 p.m. Silence enveloped the room. So silent, I could hear the ticking of my wristwatch mainspring. I held my breath, waiting. Maybe Mr. Allister was just scaring me. Maybe nothing would happen. Then the clock struck 12 a.m. The electric light in my room flickered twice, then went out completely, but the darkness didn't last. A sickly, flickering yellow light crept through the gap under the door, and with that light came a scent. Not the musty smell of the old castle anymore. It was the smell of burning coal, mixed with the reeking scent of cheap perfume and the metallic tang of melting candle wax. And then, the sound hit. Not ghostly howls or moans, but it was music. A violin symphony resounding shrilly from the great hall, where I knew for certain was completely empty just moments ago. The clinking of glasses, the boisterous laughter of dozens, maybe hundreds of people. Blackwood Castle had awakened. But not in the year 2024. I didn't sleep. How could I possibly sleep? I sat, hugging my knees, back against the door for 6 hours, hand clutching the box cutter I accidentally left in my pocket. Outside that thick oak door was a completely different world. The violin music, melodious at first, gradually turned into more chaotic sounds. The sound of glass shattering, the manic laughter of drunken men, and occasionally, the sound of footsteps thudding right next to my door, accompanied by heavy gasping, as if someone were being hunted. Sometimes my doorknob turned slightly. Click. Click. My heart seemed to stop. I held my breath, staring at the brass bolt vibrating violently. A hoarse, slurring voice rang out from the other side of the door, close enough that I could imagine alcohol breath breathing onto the wood. "Open up, Elena. I know you're in there." I bit my lip until it bled to keep from screaming. I am not Elena. I am Thomas. And I am in the year 2024. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. I looked at the clock. 6 a.m. No warning bell. Just simply the music cutting out, as if someone pulled the plug. The sickly yellow light under the door vanished, replaced by a cold white light, of the automatic hallway fluorescent lights turning on. The wind howling outside the window returned. I waited another 10 minutes, 6:10 a.m., before trembling to my feet, legs numb. I undid the latch, cracked the door open, and looked out. The hallway was empty. The wooden floor was polished, clean, as if no one had ever walked on it. No broken glass shards, no traces of a party. I let out a breath, laughing dryly. Could I be hallucinating due to a gas leak? Or had insomnia driven me mad? I stepped out, intending to go down to the kitchen to make coffee when my foot stepped on something crunchy. I bent down. On the shiny black ebony floor, right in front of my door, were drops of deep red candle wax, hardened, but they were still warm. I used my fingernail to pry up a piece of wax. It smelled strongly of animal fat, the cheap tallow candles used from the last century, not the lavender-scented candles Mr. Allister uses. The chill returned. I walked quickly to the kitchen, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation, but when I dumped the old coffee grounds from the espresso machine, a hard object fell with a clank into the stainless steel sink. I picked it up. It was a brass button, tarnished by oxidation, the size of a coin. On the button, face was carved a crest of a raven scavenging a corpse, the symbol of the Blackwood family. But what was terrifying was, stuck to the shank of the button was a scrap of scorched gray fabric and something dry, dark brown. Dried blood. I abandoned the coffee, sprinted up to my room, opened my laptop, and typed furiously into the Google search bar, Blackwood Castle History 1887. Results appeared immediately. An article from the National Library of Scotland, the headline running in bold text, Mystery of Mass Disappearance at Winter Ball 1887. I clicked on the illustration. It was an old charcoal sketch depicting the castle servants lining up to welcome guests. I zoomed in on the photo. The male servant's uniform was a gray tailcoat, and on their chests was a row of brass buttons carved with a raven, identical to the one I was clutching in my hand. My hand started shaking uncontrollably. Last night was not a hallucination. Last night, this entire castle actually turned back time, and judging by the blood on the button, I knew what happened at that ball was not just dancing. The next 3 days passed in extreme vigilance. I drank coffee instead of water, set 5 alarms on my phone, each 15 minutes apart starting from 10 p.m. I told myself I would never let myself fall into a dangerous situation again. But fatigue is a patient enemy. It does not attack all at once, it lurks. That afternoon, Mr. Allister assigned me the task of inventorying the wine cellar in the basement. It was a damp, cold labyrinth filled with dust-covered wine bottles from the last century. The lack of oxygen down there, combined with the faint smell of wine yeast, made my head groggy. I planned to nap for 10 minutes on a rickety wooden chair in the corner of the room. Just 10 minutes. When I woke up with a start, darkness had enveloped the cellar. My neck was sore from the awkward sleeping position. I fumbled for the phone in my pocket, turned on the screen. The blue light of the screen hit my face, and the numbers displayed made my stomach tighten, like someone punched me hard in the stomach. 11:55 p.m. No, it can't be. I groaned, bolted up, knocking over a stack of empty bottles. Smash! The sound of breaking glass echoed in the silence like a gunshot. I had exactly 5 minutes to run from the east basement to my room on the 3rd floor west. Under normal conditions, I need at least 7 minutes of fast walking. I didn't walk. I bolted like a mad beast. I burst through the cellar door, running for my life through the vast kitchen. My lungs started burning like fire. My legs pounded against the ice-cold stone floor. 11:57 p.m. I had only reached the foot of the main staircase. 2 more floors and a seemingly endless corridor left. I stopped breathing regularly, just gulping air into my aching chest. I jumped 2 steps at a time, hand gripping the slippery railing for momentum. The corridor lights began to flicker. The air began to thicken. I knew this sign. It was coming. 11:58 p.m. I reached the 3rd floor. The corridor leading to my room stretched before me. My room door was at the end, about 50 meters away. But just like the first night, the hallway seemed to stretch. The portraits on the walls stared at me. The eyes of the Blackwood ancestors seemed to mock my desperate efforts. "Go, Thomas, go!" I screamed in my head. I pulled out the key, clutching it in my hand while sprinting. Hand sweat made the key slippery. Elva, femtionio p.m. Tio meters left. Fem meters. 12 meters. My hand touched the freezing doorknob. I inserted the key into the lock. And then, bong. The grandfather clock in the hall struck the first chime. Deep. Shaking the floor under my feet, I turned the key. Click. The lock opened. But before I could push the door open, a powerful invisible force threw me back into the corridor. It was like a whirlwind, but thick and with a foul stench. I fell back onto the wooden floor, sliding a distance, the key flying away. Bong. Bong. The electric lights cut out. Darkness fell like a thick blanket sealing my eyes. I scrambled up, trying to orient myself in the pitch darkness. But then, the light returned. Not electric lights. Hundreds of candles on the wall sconces simultaneously burst into flame with a foot sound. The orange-white flames danced, casting long ghostly shadows on the walls. The corridor changed completely. The worn-out red carpets vanished, replaced by brand-new blue velvet carpet. The bare stone walls were now covered in silk. I was kneeling in the middle of the hallway, and I was no longer alone. About 10 steps away from me, right at the turn of the stairs, a figure was standing there. A woman in a Victorian maid's dress, her white apron covered in dark red stains. She stood with her back to me, her shoulders trembling violently, as if she were crying. I held my breath, trying to back away toward my room door. She slowly turned her head. Her neck rotated an impossible 180 degrees, accompanied by the dry snap of breaking bones. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, and her mouth. Her mouth was sewn shut with black thread. She looked straight at me, and then she raised a finger and pointed at me, emitting a gurgling sound from her torn throat. He sees us. The maid's scream did not sound human. It was like water boiling in a kettle, a gurgling, wet sound coming from her torn throat. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. Survival instinct kicked hard into my brain. I scrambled up, lunged toward the nearest alcove, where a thick red velvet curtain hung from the high ceiling. I ducked behind the curtain, pressed my back against the cold stone wall, hands covering my mouth to stop the gasping. As soon as I finished hiding, the corridor exploded with sound. The large double doors at the end of the hall burst open. Waltz music rushed in, shrill and frantic. Dozens of footsteps pounded on the wooden floor, the rustling of dresses, the fake laughter. I tremblingly opened a small slit through the thick velvet to look out. The sight before me froze my blood. The corridor was filled with people, gentlemen in shiny black tailcoats, ladies in puffy dresses like mobile bird cages. They walked, bowed to each other, raised glasses in toast. But something was wrong. Very wrong. They were not transparent, they were not floating. They were solid. A fat man stood right next to my hiding spot. I could see the pores on his nose, red from wine. I smelled the strong musk perfume coming from him. As he swung his arm, laughing loudly, the hem of his vest brushed the curtain, tapping lightly against my shoulder. It had weight. It had temperature. These were not invisible memory ghosts. These were flesh and blood people. I wasn't just seeing the past. I was in the past. Or worse, the past had become a physical reality pressing down on my present. "Excellent wine, isn't it, Earl?" the fat man said, his voice booming. But the person opposite him did not answer. It was a tall, thin man standing with his back to me. He only nodded, a mechanical, stiff nod. Then, the fat man repeated, in the exact same tone, the exact same arm gesture. "Excellent wine, isn't it, Earl?" The other person nodded again. "Excellent wine, isn't it, Earl?" Another nod. They repeated that action like a skipped record, every 10 seconds, and then I saw the Earl. He turned around. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was the man from the portrait hanging in the Great Hall, Sir Edward Blackwood. But his face, his eyes were completely empty. No pupils, just two deep, opaque white pits. And in his hand, instead of a wine glass, was a shining silver dagger. The most terrible thing was that the fat man didn't realize it. He still laughed, still asked that question, while blood started to seep from the corners of his mouth, dripping onto his pure white shirt. Drip, drip. They were cursed actors in a deadly play with no end. And I was the only survivor audience in this mad theater. Suddenly, the music cut out. Everyone in the corridor stopped at once, dead silent. Dozens of heads slowly turned toward the curtain where I was hiding. I held my breath, pressing my body against the freezing stone wall, closing my eyes, waiting for the cold hand of a corpse to drag me out. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Nothing happened. No shouting of intruder. Instead, another sound rang out. Smash! I peeked my eyes open. It turned out they weren't looking at my curtain. They were looking at a young maid who had just dropped a silver wine tray in the middle of the hallway. Dark red wine flooded the floor, looking like a pool of fresh blood. And that was the signal. The fat man standing next to me suddenly clutched his throat. His boisterous laughter cut out, replaced by choking, gagging sounds. White foam gushed from his mouth, mixed with fresh blood. "Almonds," he moaned, then collapsed, hitting his head hard against the base of the wall right where I stood. I jumped, shrinking back. His fat corpse lay on the hem of the curtain, and I felt the weight of death pressing on the toes of my shoes. The bitter smell of almonds wafted up strongly. Cyanide. The entire corridor turned into an earthly hell in an instant. Noble ladies began clawing at their own faces, fingernails tearing flesh in extreme agony. Elegant gentlemen writhed on the floor like fish out of water. The sound of vomiting, moans, and bones hitting the wooden floor formed a gruesome symphony. Amidst that chaos, only one person remained standing, Earl Edward Blackwood. He walked leisurely among the twitching corpses, his black velvet cloak gliding lightly over the pools of blood. He was not panicked at all. He was enjoying it. In his hand was the silver dagger. Every time he passed someone not quite dead, he bent down, whispered something, then S-L-Ash, a decisive cut across the throat. I covered my mouth to stop the dry heaving. This was not just a poisoning. This was a sacrificial ritual. A bloody invitation card slid right to the curtain gap. Gold-plated capitalized letters hit my eyes. In commemoration of the Blood Moon ceremony, the 14th of November, 1887. So I was right. I was witnessing the event that wiped out the entire Blackwood family. But history books said they died in a fire. No one mentioned daggers. No one mentioned them being slaughtered one by one like cattle. I must go. I must leave this corridor of death immediately. Taking advantage of the Earl being busy with a victim at the end of the corridor, I moved my feet, intending to sneak toward the service stairs leading to the attic. But as I just lifted my foot, my sneaker sole made a small creak on the wooden floor covered in blood and wine. That sound was tiny compared to the surrounding pathetic wailing, but Earl Blackwood heard it. He stopped. The dagger was still deeply embedded in a woman's chest. He slowly stood up straight, did not turn around immediately. He tilted his head, like a predator hearing a broken twig. Then, he turned around. His deathly pale, cloudy eyes didn't just glance past anymore. This time, it bored straight into the curtain gap where I was hiding. The corner of his mouth twitched up, revealing black, jagged teeth. He pulled the dagger out, licking a streak of fresh blood on the blade, and spoke not the repeating lines of the script, but a completely new sentence. I smell the scent of the future, the scent of life. The script was broken. He saw me. The Earl stepped forward. Each of his steps was no longer the mechanical repetition of a ghost. He came toward me with a graceful, predatory liveliness. The silver dagger in his hand was no longer tarnished. It reflected the flickering candlelight, cold and razor-sharp. I backed away, hitting the stone wall behind the curtain. No way out. A lost soul, his voice rang out, sounding like metal scraping against stone. Has Alistair sent me another new gift? A lister. My boss's name. My stomach tightened. He didn't just know about this, he was an accomplice. He sent me here not to be a butler, but to be the next vessel for this damnable loop. When the Earl's shiny leather shoes stopped right at the edge of the curtain, I knew I could hide no longer. I gathered all my strength, using both hands to push the heavy velvet curtain hard toward him. He was covered by the thick cloth for a split second. I didn't hesitate, dashed out, stepped on the fat man's corpse, and ran for my life in the opposite direction. Catch him! He didn't scream, but his command was like an electric current running down the corridor. The corpses writhing on the floor suddenly stopped moving. Ladies with torn faces, gentlemen with overflowing mouth foam, all simultaneously turned their heads toward me. They started to crawl. They did not stand up and walk like normal people. They crawled on all fours, joints cracking as they twisted their bodies to chase me. I dived into a side door, running down the stairs leading toward the kitchen. I had to find an exit. I had to escape this insane time boundary. But as I ran through the main dining room, I stopped dead. At the long table, a man was sitting there, quietly using a knife and fork to cut a piece of raw red beef. That person was me. No, not the current me. It was a version of me, but wearing a Victorian butler's outfit. The 1887 me looked up, smiling at myself with a blood-stained face. "Don't run, Thomas," that version said, his voice light. "The boundary is gone. You've always been here. You will always be here." I looked down at my hands. In the candlelight, the skin on the back of my hands began to peel, revealing the gray fabric of the old uniform. I began to taste the metallic flavor in my mouth. The smell of coal was no longer outside. It came from my own breath. "No," I screamed, grabbed a wine bottle from the shelf, and smashed it hard on the head of the version sitting at the table. The bottle shattered, but there was no blood. Only red candle wax gushed from the wound on my head. I turned and ran again, but behind me, the scratching of dozens of hands on the wooden floor was closing in. I lunged into the food lift, a narrow wooden cage used to transport trays between floors. No time to think about the tightness or safety. I slipped inside and pulled the rope with all my remaining strength. The cage shook violently, screeching with dry metallic sounds as it descended into the basement darkness. Right above my head, pale hands with blackened fingernails began poking through the gaps in the lift door. The sound of wood being torn sounded like animal claws. Boom! The cage hit the basement floor with a powerful impact that made me collapse. I scrambled out, hoping the darkness of the wine cellar would hide me, but the basement was no longer dark. Hundreds of tallow candles were placed on stands made of human bone. I swear I saw white knuckles at the base, emitting a pale, sickly light. And in the middle of the cellar, right on the stone wine press, was Alistair. He was no longer the weak 70-year-old man I met in the office. He wore a silk ceremonial robe embroidered with gold thread, his face terrifyingly young, eyes burning with fanaticism. "Too late, Thomas," Alistair said, holding a ledger bound in human skin open. "The loop needs new blood to keep turning. Do you know why Blackwood never fades? Because every 100-year cycle, we need an outsider to bear the sins of tonight." I backed away, hitting a wine rack. But the wine bottles no longer contained wine. They contained lumpy, dark matter. Pieces of human organs, preserved in alcohol. "What have you done?" I stammered, grabbing a rusty iron bar from the wall. "We do nothing. We just exist." Alistair walked closer, each of his steps making the reality around me shake. The stone walls of the cellar began to crack, revealing underneath not dirt and stone, but raw red flesh pulsating like a living entity. This whole castle isn't a building, it's a creature, and the time loop is its heartbeat. "Do you see the scar on your hand?" He pointed at my hand. I looked down. The wound from the key earlier was no longer bleeding red. It was turning black, and black threads began to sew my flesh back together themselves, exactly like the maid's mouth upstairs. "You are becoming a part of us. By 6 a.m., your soul will be locked into the year 1887. You will be the Earl's permanent butler." A sharp pain shot from my arm straight to my brain. I felt my memories of London, of debt, of modern life fading away like a dream upon waking. I started remembering parties I never attended, the smell of gunpowder, and the taste of poison in wine. "I'm about to disappear. Get out," I roared, swinging the iron bar at Alistair. But the iron bar went through him like going through a layer of smoke. He laughed, the laughter echoing throughout the basement, merging with the screams of the victims above. "You cannot defeat time with iron, Thomas. You can only survive if you find what this loop has lost." Right then, from behind Alistair, the darkness parted. Earl Edward Blackwood stepped down from the stone stairs, the silver dagger in his hand, dripping blood steadily onto the floor. He didn't look at Alistair, he looked at me. "Come here, my butler," the Earl whispered. "It's time to clean up the party." The Earl stepped forward, slowly like a ghost, enjoying the fear of its prey. Every time his leather shoes touched the cellar floor, reality shrank. I saw digital cameras and modern electric light bulbs on the ceiling melt, turning into tarnished brass candle holders. "What the loop has lost." I repeated Alistair's words in my head, breath intermittent. I looked around this mad cellar. Blood, organs, crawling corpses, all were part of the ritual. But every ritual has a center, a conduit. My gaze stopped at the giant grandfather clock, placed in the cellar corner, an item out of place among the wine bottles. It didn't run on clockwork. Inside the glass case, instead of a copper pendulum, was a real human heart hung by tiny silver chains. It was still beating. Thump, thump. Every beat of that heart matched perfectly, with the clock chimes echoing down from the hall. It was the heartbeat of the castle. It was the anchor keeping me in 1887. "Don't look at it!" Alistair screamed, his youthful face distorted with anger. He lunged toward me, but this time he was no longer smoke. Panic had made him more real. I dodged Alistair's lunge, scrambling toward the clock. Earl Edward let out a heart-wrenching roar, the sound no longer human, but the cry of a wounded beast. He threw the silver dagger at me. Swish! The blade grazed my shoulder, tearing through the shirt and leaving a deep gash. Pain like being splashed with acid made me kneel, but instead of red blood, a thick, black tar-like fluid flowed from the wound. I was running out of time. My arm began to stiffen, the skin turning the gray of a corpse. I grabbed the rusty iron bar from before, gathered all my remaining strength, and stabbed hard into the clock's glass. Smash! Shards of broken glass embedded in my hand, but I didn't stop. I reached inside, grabbed that pulsating hot heart. A sticky, disgusting feeling spread throughout my body. It was not cold. It was burning hot, like a burning coal. Stop! The Earl was right behind me. His ice-cold hand squeezed my neck, lifting me off the ground. My vision began to darken. My lungs tightened, but I still held that heart tight. With a decisive motion, I yanked hard. The silver chain snapped. A terrifying scream rang out, not from the Earl's mouth, but from the castle walls themselves. The entire building shook violently, as if in a 10 Richter scale earthquake. The corpses crawling above melted into pools of black water. Alistair collapsed, his body aging at a dizzying speed, skin wrinkling, and then peeling off the bone in just seconds. Earl Edward let go of my neck. He looked down at his hands, gradually turning to ashes. His white eyes for the first time showed a flicker of reason, a terrifying serenity. Finally, he whispered, then vanished into the void. I fell onto the floor. The heart in my hands stopped beating and withered into a pitch-black stone. Darkness enveloped me, but this time no candlelight was lit again. In my trance, I saw the numbers on my wristwatch jump. 5:59 a.m. Sunlight crept through the cracks of the basement, not the sallow light of candles, but the cold, pale whiteness of the Highland morning. I woke up amidst the ruins. Blackwood Castle no longer had the gloomy grandeur of last night. Around me, precious wine racks had rotted, collapsed into piles of wood mulch. Wine bottles broken long ago, only a thick layer of decades-old dust remained. Alistair was not there. No corpses, no traces of the massacre. Only the smell of mold and a bone-chilling silence. I stumbled to my feet, my whole body aching as if just hit by a truck. Looking down at my hands, I was stunned. The gray fabric of the 1,887 butler uniform was still there, but it was tattered and hollow, as if it had lain in a grave for centuries. The wound on my shoulder was no longer leaking black fluid, but it had closed into a tangled scar, bruised, looking like a grotesque ancient character carved deep into the flesh. I ran. I didn't care about my belongings, didn't care about salary. I dashed through corridors now with peeling paint. Portraits termite-eaten to the point where human faces were no longer recognizable. As I pushed the castle's main door open, I froze. Mr. Alistair, or something that looked like him, was sitting in a dilapidated armchair on the porch. He looked more than 100 years old, skin and bone, wheezing breath. He looked at me, eyes no longer fanatical, but filled with infinite emptiness. "You've broken it," he rasped. "Blackwood's heart. It has stopped beating." "What the hell are you?" I screamed, my voice hoarse. "I'm just a gatekeeper, another slave just like you are about to become." He coughed violently. "You escaped the loop, Thomas, but you can't escape the castle. Look at yourself." I looked at my reflection in the dusty window pane. My face was still that of a 20-year-old youth, but my hair had turned completely white, and in my eyes, I could no longer see my own pupils. Just a milky white, exactly like Earl Edward. I turned my back and ran straight into the forest, not daring to look back. I ran for 15 miles to the nearest town. People there looked at me like a monster or a wandering ghost. Present. I am writing these lines in a cheap hotel room in London, curtains always closed. I went to the doctor about the scar on my shoulder. He looked at the test results and turned pale, asking me if I had been injured by a 19th century weapon, because the oxidation level on my skin tissue was equivalent to an archaeological specimen. I didn't answer. I couldn't explain. Every night, when the clock strikes 11:58 p.m., I start trembling. I lock the doors with 3 layers, cover my ears, but I still smell it. The smell of burning coal. The smell of cheap musk perfume. And the shrill violin music rising from nothingness. Last night, I saw a letter wedged under the hotel room door gap. No stamp, no sender. Inside was only a brass button, carved with a raven and a handwritten line in red ink. "The party isn't over yet, Thomas. We're just waiting for the butler to return and clean up. I know I don't have much time left. Blackwood Castle is calling me back. It doesn't need a building to exist. It exists in blood, in scars, and in the decay spreading from my hands. If you see a butler job advertisement with an unusually high salary at a castle in Scotland, please don't go. Don't believe in that money. And if you accidentally go there, make sure you are always in your room before midnight, because once the clock strikes 12, history will not only repeat itself, it will swallow you."